Kelly's World Season 1 Review, Episode 3 Revolutions, Industrialization, and Global Transformation. In the previous episode, we examined how expanding trade networks connected different regions of the world, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. In this episode, we shift our focus to the consequences of those growing connections. Specifically, we will examine how new ideas, economic transformations, and expanding global interactions reshape political systems and social structures. We will begin with the Enlightenment, a movement that challenged traditional authority and introduced new ideas about rights and governance. We will then explore how these ideas influenced major political revolutions, including the American and French revolutions. From there, we will examine the Industrial Revolution and its impact on economic systems and patterns of daily life. Finally, we will consider how industrialization contributed to the expansion of global power and imperialism. Lesson 14: The Rise of Russia. The rise of Russia in the early modern period was shaped by a combination of foreign domination, internal militarization, and state-directed development, all of which produced a political and social structure distinct from that of Western Europe. The Mongol occupation of the 13th to 15th centuries played a foundational role in this development. Rather than directly assimilating Russian lands, the Mongols ruled through a system of tribute and indirect control. This arrangement elevated the Principality of Moscow, which served as the primary tax collector for the Mongol Golden Horde. In fulfilling this role, Moscow accumulated wealth, administrative experience, and military strength, positioning it to eventually unify the surrounding territories. Just as importantly, Mongol rule reinforced patterns of centralized authority and autocratic governance that would persist in Russian political culture long after independence was achieved. Following the decline of Mongol power, Russian rulers continued to expand territorially, and this expansion shaped the structure of society. The demands of constant warfare and frontier defense required a highly organized and militarized state. In response, the Tsars developed a system in which land was granted to nobles in exchange for military service. This service aristocracy tied elite status directly to loyalty and participation in the state, preventing the emergence of an independent nobility like that seen in Western Europe. At the same time, the need for a stable labor force to support military expansion led to the tightening of serfdom, binding peasants to the land and ensuring a reliable tax base. Russia's development as a gunpowder state further reflects its unique trajectory. Unlike Western European states, which financed military expansion through commerce and taxation of a growing middle class, Russia relied on direct state control of resources and labor. The government established armories, imported foreign experts, and mobilized its population through coercive means. This allowed Russia to build a powerful military without undergoing the same level of commercial or urban development seen elsewhere. The reign of Peter the Great marked a significant attempt to modernize Russia, but his reforms highlight the limits of this transformation. Peter sought to westernize Russia by adopting European technology, military organization, and administrative practices. He reorganized the army, built a navy, and founded the city of St. Petersburg as a, quote, window to the West. However, these reforms were imposed from above and were designed to strengthen the state rather than transform society. Serfdom remained intact, and political authority remained centralized in the hands of the Tsar. As a result, Russia emerged as a powerful empire that was modern in its military capabilities but traditional in its social and political structures. Its development illustrates an alternative path to state building, one driven by coercion and centralization rather than commerce and political liberalization. Lesson 15: The Muslim Empires. The major Muslim empires of the early modern period, the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, were characterized by a combination of military strength, administrative sophistication, and a pragmatic approach to governing diverse populations. While these empires shared a common Islamic foundation, their success depended less on religious uniformity than on their ability to balance ideological authority with political flexibility. Each of these empires derived legitimacy from Islam, presenting themselves as defenders of the faith. However, they ruled over large ethnically and religiously diverse populations, which required a more complex approach to governance. As a result, these states developed systems that allowed for a degree of religious tolerance, not as a matter of principle, but as a practical necessity. Non Muslim populations were often permitted to maintain their own religious practices and legal systems, provided they accepted political subordination and paid taxes. This arrangement created stability by allowing empires to extract revenue and maintain order without forcing complete cultural or religious assimilation. At the same time, this tolerance existed alongside clear limits. Ruling elites often enforced Islamic orthodoxy when it served political purposes or when their authority was challenged. The Safavid Empire, for example, imposed Shia Islam as a unifying force, at times persecuting Sunni populations to solidify internal cohesion. Similarly, later Mughal rulers reversed earlier policies of accommodation and imposed stricter religious controls. This pattern highlights a key contradiction. Tolerance and intolerance were not opposites, but tools of governance, applied selectively depending on political needs. The Ottoman Empire provides a particularly clear example of this balance. It developed institutions such as the millet system, which allowed religious communities to govern themselves in matters of law and culture while remaining under imperial authority. At the same time, the Ottoman state maintained strong central control through its military and administrative systems. Its early expansion was closely tied to militarization, particularly along the frontier between the Islamic and Christian worlds. This frontier environment fostered a culture of warfare that helped legitimize Ottoman rule and attract followers. Over time, however, the very structures that supported Ottoman expansion began to create internal tensions. Military institutions such as the Janissaries, originally an elite and disciplined force, became increasingly entrenched and resistant to reform. As the empire expanded and its administrative system grew more complex, new economic and social pressures emerged, contributing to internal conflict between traditional military elites and emerging bureaucratic and economic groups. Taken together, the Muslim empires illustrate a broader pattern of early modern state building. Their strength lay in their ability to combine ideological legitimacy with pragmatic governance, using religion as a source of authority while adapting to the realities of diverse populations. However, this same flexibility also produced internal contradictions that would, over time, contribute to challenges in maintaining stability and adapting to changing global conditions. Lesson 16: Asia in an Era of Change. In the early modern period, major Asian states such as Ming and Qing China and Tokugawa Japan faced the challenge of responding to increasingly global interaction while maintaining internal stability. Rather than fully embracing or rejecting external influence, these states pursued strategies of controlled engagement, allowing them to preserve political authority while adapting selectively to changing conditions. In China, the Ming Dynasty initially demonstrated a capacity for outward expansion and engagement. This was most clearly seen in the voyages of Cheng He in the early 15th century, which projected Chinese power across the Indian Ocean and established tributary relationships with distant regions. However, these expeditions were eventually abandoned, and the Ming state shifted towards a more inward focused policy. This decision reflected both the high cost of maritime expansion and a broader preference for maintaining internal order over pursuing external influence. Under the Qing dynasty, China continued to manage foreign interaction through regulated systems such as the tribute system and restricted trade networks. Foreign merchants were limited in where and how they could operate, ensuring that economic exchange remained under state control. This approach allowed China to benefit from trade while minimizing the potential disruption of foreign influence. At the same time, China maintained a strong sense of cultural superiority, viewing itself as the center of a hierarchical world order. A similar pattern can be seen in Japan during the Tokugawa period. Following a period of internal conflict, the Tokugawa shogunate established a centralized political system that emphasized stability and social order. To maintain this stability, Japan adopted policies of relative isolation, restricting foreign contact and limiting trade primarily to controlled interactions with select partners such as the Dutch. This policy, often referred to as sakoku, was not complete isolation, but rather a deliberate effort to regulate external influence. These policies were motivated by concerns about both political and cultural stability. Foreign religions, particularly Christianity, were seen as potential threats to centralized authority, as they could undermine traditional hierarchies and loyalties. By limiting external contact, the Tokugawa state sought to prevent internal disruption while maintaining control over economic and social systems. Despite these restrictions, neither China nor Japan was entirely isolated. Trade continued through controlled channels, and both societies remained connected to broader regional networks. However, the key feature of their approach was the prioritization of internal stability over expansion or integration into emerging global systems. Taken together, the experiences of China and Japan in this period illustrate a distinct approach to early modern globalization. Rather than pursuing aggressive expansion or fully integrating into global networks, these states sought to manage change on their own terms. This strategy allowed them to maintain political continuity and cultural identity, but it also limited their ability to respond to the rapidly shifting global balance of power that would emerge in the following centuries. Lesson 17. The Industrial Revolution begins. The Industrial Revolution marked a fundamental transformation in how goods were produced, how economies were organized, and how people lived and worked. Beginning in Britain in the late 18th century, it represented a shift from agrarian, labor intensive production to mechanized, factory based systems that dramatically increased output and efficiency. Several factors explain why industrialization began in Britain. One of the most important was the availability of natural resources, particularly coal and iron, which were essential for powering machines and constructing industrial infrastructure. In addition, Britain had access to capital from its expanding global trade networks, allowing investors to finance new technologies and factories. Political stability and a legal system that protected property rights also encouraged economic innovation and risk taking. Equally significant was the role of agriculture in enabling industrial growth. Advances in agricultural productivity reduced the need for labor in rural areas, freeing workers to move to cities in search of employment. This process of urbanization created a large labor force that could be employed in factories, supporting the expansion of industrial production. The introduction of new technologies was a defining feature of the Industrial Revolution. Machines such as the spinning jenny and the power loom increased the speed and efficiency of textile production, while the steam engine allowed factories to operate independently of traditional energy sources like water. These innovations not only transformed individual industries, but also contributed to broader economic change by lowering production costs and increasing the availability of goods. However, the Industrial Revolution was not solely a story of progress. It also produced significant social challenges. Working conditions in factories were often harsh, with long hours, low wages, and minimal safety protections. Child labor was widespread, and many workers lived in overcrowded and unsanitary urban environments. These conditions led to the emergence of new social tensions, and eventually to movements aimed at improving labor conditions and regulating industrial practices. At the same time, industrialization contributed to long term economic growth and increased standards of living for some segments of society. It created new industries, expanded markets, and encouraged technological innovation. Over time, these developments would reshape not only individual economies, but also global patterns of trade and production. The Industrial Revolution, therefore, represents more than a technological shift. It marks the beginning of a new economic system. It fundamentally altered the relationship between labor, capital, and production, creating both new opportunities and new inequalities. Understanding the transformation is essential for analyzing the development of the modern industrial world and its lasting global impact. Lesson 18: Industrialization and Imperialism. Industrialization fundamentally altered the global balance of power by creating new economic demands that extended beyond national borders. As industrial economies expanded, they required increasing amounts of raw materials and access to new markets, driving a new phase of imperial expansion in the 19th century. Unlike earlier forms of empire building, which were often motivated by trade routes or territorial prestige, this wave of imperialism was closely tied to the structural needs of industrial economies. Industrialized nations required steady supplies of resources such as cotton, rubber, minerals, and oil to sustain factory production. At the same time, they needed markets in which to sell manufactured goods. These dual demands created a powerful incentive to establish control over foreign regions, ensuring both reliable access to resources and guaranteed outlets for industrial products. As a result, imperial expansion became increasingly systematic and economically driven. Technological advancements played a critical role in enabling this expansion. Improvements in transportation, such as steamships and railroads, made it easier to move goods and people across long distances. Advances in communication, including the telegraph, allowed governments to coordinate and manage far flung territories more effectively. Military innovations, such as more advanced firearms, gave industrialized nations a significant advantage over societies that had not undergone similar transformations. The result was a rapid expansion of European and, to a lesser extent, American and Japanese influence across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. This expansion often involved the direct imposition of political control, as well as the restructuring of local economies to serve the needs of the imperial power. Colonized regions were frequently reorganized to produce specific raw materials, limiting their economic independence and tying them into a global system dominated by industrialized nations. At the same time, imperialism was justified through a range of ideological arguments. Concepts such as social Darwinism and the so-called civilizing mission were used to present expansion as both natural and beneficial. These ideas framed imperialism as a process of bringing progress and order to less developed regions, masking the economic motivations that underpinned expansion. Despite these justifications, imperialism often had disruptive and unequal effects. Traditional political structures were weakened or replaced, and local economies were reshaped in ways that prioritized external demands over internal development. While imperialism increased global connections and facilitated the movement of goods and ideas, these connections were highly unequal, benefiting industrialized nations far more than the regions they controlled. Industrialization and imperialism are therefore best understood as interconnected processes. Industrial growth created the conditions for expansion, while imperialism provided the resources and markets necessary to sustain that growth. Together, they contributed to the development of a global system characterized by both increased integration and deepening inequality, patterns that would continue to shape the modern world. Lesson 19: Latin America in the 19th century. The 19th century in Latin America was defined by a wave of independence movements that reshaped the political map of the region. However, while these movements successfully removed colonial rule, they did not fundamentally transform the underlying social and economic structures. As a result, Latin American societies experienced a pattern of political independence combined with social and economic continuity. Independence movements in Latin America were influenced by earlier revolutions, particularly the American and French revolutions, as well as the weakening of European powers during the Napoleonic Wars. Creole elites, people of European descent born in the Americas, played a central role in these movements. They sought greater political control and economic freedom, but their goals were often limited to replacing colonial authorities rather than restructuring society. Following independence, new nations emerged across the region, but they faced significant challenges in establishing stable governments. One of the key factors contributing to instability was the persistence of existing social hierarchies. Power remained concentrated in the hands of elite groups, while the majority of the population, including indigenous peoples, enslaved individuals, and mixed race populations, continued to experience limited political and economic opportunities. This continuity of inequality contributed to the rise of caudillos, or regional strongmen, who exercised power through personal authority and military force. Caudillos often gained support by appealing to local populations, but their rule tended to reinforce instability rather than create lasting political institutions. Governments frequently changed through force rather than through stable constitutional processes, limiting the development of effective national systems. Economic patterns also remained closely tied to the colonial past. Many Latin American economies continued to rely on the export of raw materials and agricultural products such as sugar, coffee, and minerals. This dependence on exports made these economies vulnerable to fluctuations in global markets and limited the development of diversified industrial sectors. As a result, Latin America became increasingly integrated into the global economy, but often in a dependent position relative to industrialized nations. Foreign influence further reinforced this dependency. European countries and the United States invested in Latin American economies and exerted economic and political influence over the region. While this brought some development, it also limited the ability of newly independent nations to control their own economic futures. The experience of Latin America in the 19th century highlights a key pattern in world history. Political independence does not necessarily lead to social or economic transformation. While colonial rule ended, many of the structures that shaped inequality and economic dependency remained in place. This combination of independence and continuity helps explain the challenges faced by Latin American nations as they sought to build stable and equitable societies in the modern era.